hold here and in other countries. The question is what kind. And I think engaging that answer a little bit differently is the road to getting to a better place. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Andreas.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I don't know what the intentions of the organizers were, whether one of us is supposed to be a nationalist and the other one not. And so I think if that was the original plan, then maybe there's going to be some disappointment because I'm waiting for the slides to come, so I'm just talking a little bit about other things. Because I actually come down on a very similar place as Benjamin does with regard to the analysis of the current situation in which nationalism has spread both to the left and the right, has made a resurgence, and I also come down to the conclusion, similar to Benjamin, if I understood you correctly, that this is not necessarily a bad thing. So I have written about nationalism for a very long time, for over 20 years now, so before the current moment, and I have a slightly different, broader understanding of nationalism than most of you will have, and I would like to, sorry to be so academic, but I would like to introduce a more broader kind of understanding of nationalism than the current association with far right-wing populist policies. And so it is associated today with the far right or even with white nationalism. That's what most people associate when they hear the term nationalism. And in the eyes of liberals, of the mainstream educated population, such bad nationalism, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, chauvinist, and so on, stands in opposition to the good patriotism that everyone is willing to embrace. But from a, sorry, I have to move a little bit here because I have to see my slides are down here in the corner. But from a historical and comparative point of view, so if we make a step back, both are actually variants of nationalism. And it's only after World War II that patriotism became systematically distinguished from nationalism. Basically, one of the major reasons because the Nazi Party had National Socialist in their title, and so the term kind of became a pejorative term in the eyes of Western democracies. But both patriotism and nationalism are based on the same principles of political legitimacy. And the first one is the idea that states should be governed by members of the nation, that elites should be, in terms of their national background, like the people over whom they rule. Rather, so they shouldn't be foreigners, and so the foreign rule as in empires, British over Indians, the Manchu dynasty in Qing, China, and so on, became delegitimized. The second principle is that rulers, state elites, should primarily care about the interests of the national majority. They should be accountable to the members of the nation rather than rule in the name of their own interests, such as the interest of a dynastic house, as was the case in the pre-nationalist period of politics around the world. So nationalism and patriotism both are more or less nativist in the sense of that they're asking for control over the state by locals, by people who have deep roots on the territory and show a deep commitment to the local population. Now, how the nation's defined, how inclusionary, how exclusionary is a different, whether it embraces domestic minorities or not, whether it embraces recent members of the nation, immigrants and so on, that's a different question, but the tendency is nevertheless the same. And second, all forms of nationalism are populist. They privilege the interest of the masses over those of political and economic elites. And so this is just a kind of a conceptual clarification to kind of popularize the idea that nationalism is actually not exclusively, not even foremostly, a matter of the right-wing, anti-immigrant, chauvinist end of the political spectrum. And I would like to go a little bit further with some historical clarifications, with apologies to those who are mostly interested in the present moment and in the economic policy domain. Compared to other kinds of major political ideologies, nationalism is relatively poorly elaborated, is a relatively primitive political ideology, like many observers have noted over the years. And it is therefore very flexible and has historically combined or entered a marriage with lots of different kinds of ideological currents. It was in the 19th century in Europe, it was associated with liberalism, with classical political liberalism, as in the nationalist movements that swept through Europe in 1848 and then later on again. So that's how nationalism started, as a thoroughly liberal, committed to the idea of rule of law, committed to the idea of democracy and so on, ideology. It then combined with fascism in the interwar period, when right-wing movements that were nationalist/fascist came to power in Germany, in Italy, in Hungary, and so on and so on. After the Second World War, nationalism combined with communism in many of the anti-colonial movements in the global south that were mobilizing against empire. Many of these movements were actually carried forward or even dominated by communist party organizations, such as in Vietnam and in the Chinese fight against Japan, and so on and so on. So today, all major ideological currents kind of carry forward this legacy of nationalist thinking in one way or another, maybe with the exception of orthodox free market libertarian kind of thinking, where nationalism indeed does not play much of a role. So the anti-immigrant populist nationalism of today emphasizes the nativist principle and turns it against immigrants, while the left-wing socialist movements emphasize the populist aspect of nationalism in their suggesting to tax the wealthy or the wealth of the very, very rich citizens away. So both rely on nationalist principles, on these twofold nationalist principles that I have mentioned. So are we all nationalists now? In a way, yes. So that's kind of my agreement with Benjamin's current diagnosis, although I come to it from a different kind of angle. I would like to also emphasize, and this is kind of dear to my heart as a historically minded sociologist, how deeply rooted nationalism is, not only in our ideologies, in the major kind of political currents, as I just tried to argue, but also in the institutional structures of the world that we live in with. And nationalism is, and I'm going through a series of institutional domains to show how deeply they're influenced by these twofold nationalist principles of thought and that I just mentioned. So nationalism basically provided the ideological foundation for the modern global system of states, the idea that each nation deserves a state on its own. The idea of national sovereignty is deeply influenced, of course, by the late 19th, early 20th century versions of nationalism. And so the entire state system actually is built on a nationalist foundation. Second, nationalism also provides an answer to the question that every democratic polity raises, or every democratic principle raises, which is, where are the boundaries of the people that should govern themselves according to democratic rule. And nationalism provides the answer to that. Only citizens, members of the nation, should allowed to vote. So Guatemaltecans and Zimbabweans, it seems trivial, but one has to take a step back to see that it's maybe not that trivial, should not actually vote in an American elections, and Americans should not vote in a Guatemaltecan election. And third, since in the eyes of nationalist ideologues, the nation itself should not be further divided into strata with different rights and privileges. That's what nationalists argued against when nationalist movements came out of feudal and imperial states in the 19th century. Since there's this image of equality, a definition, that's a defining criteria of the nation, legal equality, nationalism also has been married historically to the idea of equal citizenship. And many of the nationalist movement have propelled this idea very forcefully and sought to realize it. And the first book on nationalism was by a legal scholar called Francis Lieber, and I'm proud to report that my named chair here at Columbia is named after Mr. Lieber. That's maybe why I know about him. He's otherwise not very popular. So, but he was he wrote actually the first book with on nationalism, and he opposed the principle of nationalism or nationhood to the Confederacy, to the principle of legal inequality, slavery, that at the time was still the law of the land in the South. So revealing this historical association between nationalism and the idea of the nation and legal equality. Then finally, nationalism also motivated the development of welfare systems, of redistributive systems, without the idea of the nation as a kind of a hyper-extended family where every member owes solidarity to every other member, even if they're perfect strangers and have never met and have no real family ties with each other. Without that idea, actually welfare systems would have been very hard to legitimize. And historically speaking, most of the thrust in the development of welfare systems came after massive wars, mobilization for war, in times of very strong nationalist sentiments of distinctiveness and collective sacrifice. Nationalism also underpinned the massive expansion of public goods provisions by the modern state. So once the state is supposed to act in the name and in the interest of the nation, it is appropriate to erect public health systems for members of the nation, systems of public education where children would, among other things, be taught also the national language, national history, be forged into this national mold of and be taught, a sentiment of pride in the achievement of their own nation. National infrastructure projects, national highway systems, the park system in the US and so on, all of this, of course, deeply infused by sentiments of national belonging, mission, and distinctiveness, and so on. Okay. Okay, let me skip that. We have this watch here, by the way, that's such a brutally disciplining element. It's brilliant. It is so simple. Okay, so let me say something. So I argued that most of the current major political movements have a nationalist component, and I argued that this is because nationalism is so deeply institutionally rooted in our current societies, at least in the developed West, that it's difficult to actually argue outside of nationalist frameworks. However, nationalism comes and goes. Sometimes it becomes hot and virulent, like today. Sometimes it recedes to the background. It's more like a quiet assumption, ideological assumption that everybody makes. So I argue that when one of these twofold principles of nationalism is violated, then the likelihood that you get hot nationalism, that it becomes politically salient, that political movements pick it up, increases. And so when national self-rule, the first principle, is violated, movements are likely to emerge to call for the restoration of what is perceived as a violation of the principle of national self-rule. And the anti-European Union movements across Europe, at least if you believe in the analysis that I made so far, are kind of not surprising to eventually emerge because they can so easily be portrayed as a violation of the principle of self-rule. You have the Eurocrats, you have Brussels, you have Diktat from far away that is not fully democratically legitimized either. So it can be easily portrayed as a version of a kind of a new colonialism, or rather a new imperial kind of situation. And you have the anti-Soviet movements during the Gorbachev era that are also, the Baltic states and so on, and then it spread to the Caucasus that are also, that took this opportunity to decry, to scandalize that the principle of national self-rule had been violated for decades under Soviet rule. When the political elites rule in the interests of global interests or of economic growth, independent of its distributional consequences, or in the name of human rights, then movements to restore the priority of concern for the average member of the nation emerge. So if this principle of nationalist doctrine is violated, you might have movements as well. Anti-immigrant movements in Germany in the wake of the de facto open border policy that lasts for a couple of months. Anti-elite populism that you have today in the United States after a long period of disregard for the consequences of economic policy making for the average working class member of the country. These movements can emerge from the right, from the left, such as the two presidential candidates now, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and so on and so on and so on. Or they can emerge from the right, Trump, Le Pen, all the other kind of right-wing movements all across Europe. Of course, whether and when exactly such movements emerge also depends on leadership. What you need is someone who has the skills as a political entrepreneur to scandalize the present situations or to mobilize these nationalist tropes and rhetorics effectively. You have to have the organizational tools to do so. You have to create a movement, followers, you have to fundraise, all of these kinds of things. And whether it emerges on the left or on the right, I didn't want to go into that because it gets complicated. Depends also on the configuration of parties in a particular country, and then all kinds of things matter, whether you have a two-party system, whether you have a multi-party system, whether the left, and that's most important, still has a grip on voting class voters, whether the on working class voters, whether the working classes are still organizationally bound to the parties of the left, or whether these organizational bonds have been broken, as in the US, where they have not, like in Portugal, where the Communist Party still has, its cells in all across the country, including in the rural parts of the country, and where this discontent was channeled through, or nationalist discontent was channeled through the established party system. So all kinds of things come into play that I would not like to talk about in too much detail. When these principles of nationalist doctrine are not violated or not as visibly as in the times that I was just talking about, then these movements fade away or they never develop, they recede into the background, and that is perhaps the case from the 1950s into the 70s in the developed West, when liberalism was combined with a healthy dose of nationalist priorities. Here I slightly agree with what you have said about a lot of the 1950s, 60s kind of compact being the unintended consequences of policies that were not actually meant to do so, but maybe I don't know enough about the US case. In any case, so the present moment, I have 23 seconds in the US, and thankfully this is my last slide as well. So, and this is just a bunch of arguments that I am putting forward, maybe more as a citizen than as an researcher. I believe that to combat aggressive anti-immigrant and globally disruptive forms of nationalism, it has to be tamed by bringing it back to the mainstream of politics and policymaking. And so just a bunch of talking points. The relevant benchmark for to measure the success of an economic policy maybe should be the living standards of the bottom 20 or 50% of the population, rather than fetishize economic growth, as has been the case in the past generations. And in trade and immigration policies, the interests of working and middle-class Americans should be privileged over those of global corporations, foreign workers, and future immigrants, as has been the case, I think, in the past generation or so. And this can be easily be combined with a reaffirmation, so it doesn't have to be an anti-immigrant, xenophobic kind of position. This can be combined with the reaffirmation of narratives here in the US about the United States as a nation of immigrants, that's a source of pride and as something that distinguishes the US from other similar countries, and a commitment to end both undocumented immigration, which is unique to the US at least in the dimensions, on the one hand, and also end the outcast status of undocumented immigrants that are already in the country, so some kind of path to citizenship. And similarly, the shared interest of a diverse nation should be emphasized, rather than pitting whites and males against all others, as it is currently done, both by right-wing nationalists who defend, the privileged place of whites and males in the moral order of the nation, and liberal progressives who try to overturn this situation but rely on the same basic categories of identity. So a renewed emphasis. Mark Lilla, who is a colleague here in history, has some detailed suggestions of how to do that, and I kind of think that they're pretty reasonable and sound. Okay, maybe I'll just stop here because much of what I am outlining here, which is kind of derived more from an analysis, is actually already happening across the political spectrum. Most of these points that I'm raising are picked up by one or the other political movement. So it looks like nationalism and nationalist concerns, both for self-rule and for privileging the interests of a national majority over elites, has already been seeping into the political platforms of the various parties. And overall, I think this might not be a bad thing at all. Thank you.
Morning, I'm Charles Cobb. I'm officially a recovering lawyer, but for 15 years I